Is it fair to say you believe you had the support of the Office of the Attorney General in the way you were conducting and handling the issue of racial profiling?
Yes, sir.
Hearings into racial profiling. Hearings designed to uncover who knew what and when. But was there ever a better day? Any real attempt to reform the state police? This former Attorney General says yes. The committee hasn't asked him to testify, but we will on this edition of Due Process.
Major funding for Due Process is made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding is provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual.
Disgraced an entire state and damaged a governor. Now the judicial career of a former attorney general may hang in the balance. I'm Raymond Brown, and I'm talking, of course, about racial profiling. It's the subject right now of ongoing Senate hearings, which focus in part on state Supreme Court Justice and former Attorney General Peter Verniro. But in this half hour, we'll hear from another former Attorney General who says the profiling scandal could have been avoided if the Florio administration's state police reforms had been continued. But first, we hear from Sandy King.
Raymond, Bob Del Tufo thinks the Senate Judiciary Committee should be aware of what came before. He says it really was a better time when making drug arrests was deemed less important than making sure the rights of black drivers were not trampled. So when the committee failed to call Del Tufo, he sent a long, unsolicited statement, which he says provides some context for the abuses that would follow and the excuses that at least one former state official is still making.
According to these statistics, one would take that that's who we're moving the drugs up. If all these, and I don't know if these arrests were all for drugs or what they were for, what the arrest was for.
Well, these are searches, not arrests.
These are searches?
Right.
More than 2 years after he was fired for justifying those searches, the former head of the state police was still defending a New Jersey policy that's become a national scandal.
The DEA, the Office of Highway Traffic Safety, et cetera, the other federal law enforcement agencies stressing that we should be very active in the eradication of drugs and other criminal activity. And on the other hand, we have the Justice Department saying, no, what you're doing is wrong.
Day 2 of state hearings into racial profiling, into who knew what and when, into why it wasn't stopped, and how long ago it started. The current superintendent is on record about that.
Now, as far as the state police and what it's done in the past, there were a lot of signs, and I think the signs were back. I mean, I can remember them being there in the early 70s.
In other words, according to Carson Dunbar, the problem of state police targeting black drivers didn't begin with the Whitman administration, but may go back at least 3 decades.
Gary Brandt, Brian Nickel.
And that's something former state officials have tended not to want to talk much about, with one prominent recent exception.
Should we or can we relax the war on drugs?
He was a first assistant attorney general under Brendan Byrne, then U.S. attorney for New Jersey. But it's his stint with Jim Florio as AG that he's talking about now. In a 23-page statement to the Senate committee members, backed up by more than 100 pages of exhibits, all designed to prove that there was an attempt to change the profiling picture, an attempt abandoned when he and Florio left office.
When Colonel Williams came in, he ended the cultural diversity and professionalism upgrading training. There seemed to be a change in attitude among some of the troopers, and just judging from the statistics that are coming out now, you can see it spike upward once again.
Del Tufo's version of events is supported by Ed Martone, back then state director of the ACLU.
These are people who called us in, us meaning ACLU and NAACP and others, asked for our input, involved us in the training of the troopers. That all just ended when the Del Tufo, Florio, Dentino people left.
Del Tufo's statement cites the ACLU as a kind of a witness to what went on. He cites the NAACP as well. Both groups had pressured for trooper reform, and both were invited to play a part in the change. Keith Jones in those days was the NAACP state president.
And we got a mountain of complaints.
He and Martone agree that Florio, Del Tufo, and their state police colonel, Justin Dentino, did bring a new tone to the state police.
I can tell you that profiles are illegal. I can tell you that if I'm confirmed by the Senate that there will be no profiles.
When Colonel Dentino came in and essentially said stop it, it stopped for a time.
Pagano's position was there is no racial profiling. His officers, both male and female, were not targeting minority drivers, and he put the wall up. When Florio came in, then came in Dentino. And frankly, we saw some relief.
Jones calls Dentino and his boss well-intentioned, but he says Del Tufo may be overstating their efforts and their results.
They couldn't deny those numbers, but they would never admit that there was a racial profiling problem and that their officers were in violation of the law.
I do think that the message from above that this won't be tolerated, we won't look the other way, you won't be Trooper of the Year, that message got through loud and clear, even if some of the other stuff is hazy in people's memories today.
We did see a momentous decrease in terms of the stops, but soon thereafter, even during the Florio years, we saw a shift moving back upward.
As soon as the pressure came off?
As soon as the public pressure came off, and as soon as the numbers in terms of the complaints began to fall.
Meanwhile, the committee, too, is concerned with profiling history. But the focus here goes back just a few years. And though Bob Del Tufo has not been called, it's the actions of a more recent Attorney General that may be at the heart of these proceedings.
Is it fair to say you believed you had the support of the Office of the Attorney General in the way you were conducting and handling the issue of racial profiling?
Yes, sir.
Was that the message you left with on May 20th, 1997, that they were okay and supportive of the state police?
Yes, sir.
So a bitter Colonel Williams was sharing the blame with the Attorney General, who he says was a willing party to profiling policy at the state police. But Verniero's potential problems go further. The committee wants to know if he testified truthfully in 1999 during 2 appearances before the Senate panel. One of those, his Supreme Court confirmation hearing. His testimony back then that he had no clear knowledge about profiling until 1998 and the Turnpike shooting of 3 black men by 2 white troopers. But the committee's been gathering evidence that may challenge that claim, and Verniero's future on the court could be at stake.
Even before this latest Senate testimony, Verniero was fighting back, admitting in a news conference last week that he had been slow to act and offering as explanation the frailties of humanity. That and more with an earlier AG, Bob Del Tufo, with the minister who's kept the profiling pressure on, and the attorney who won a precedent-setting court case on the basis of racial profiling. So stay with us.
You got to do something a little more drastic. You got to put something in effect that's going to stop it all together. You need some watchdogs or something like that, you know what I mean?
The feeling of the people is that it's the same. I mean, it's not the 60s, but it's, you know, being in the new millennium is still terrible.
The racial profiling is something real. This isn't people's imagination.
For years, for decades, for centuries, since slavery.
I don't think this is something new. I think it's newly brought to our attention, but I don't think it's new.
It's been a long time, and it's going to continue to be a long time, and I guess we'll be what? Our cars will be in the air flying around before things get better.
So, have we seen the last of racial profiling? And was it brought in check once before in the Florio years, only to spin out of control under Whitman and Vernero? Florio's Attorney General, Bob Del Tufo, is here to say that's just what happened. But we may get a different take from Reverend Reginald Jackson, chairman of the New Jersey Black Ministers Council, and attorney Bill Buckman, who's represented profiling victims in some precedent-setting cases. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
General, let me start with you. And I want to mention something that's in this week's ledger as Governor Whitman, and seems to be talking about you. Previous administrations took steps, yes, Whitman said, but then they went back to business as usual. I mean, that sounds like she's addressing your comments implicit in your report. Is she accurate that you had a good start but then went back to business as usual?
Well, I don't know what they she's referring to. Maybe she's referring to her own administration. We took steps early on in the Florio administration to replace the superintendent of state police with Justin Dentino. We had some concerns about the general management of the state police, and one of the most salient features was the issue of racial profiling. On Colonel Dentino's first day in office, he, contrary to what Keith Jones's recollection in the introduction to this show, Colonel Dentino announced that there was, in fact, abuses going on. Not that they were systemic to the state police as a whole, but that some of this was occurring, and that it wasn't going to occur anymore. And he advised his troops that if they never made another drug arrest on the turnpike, constitutional rights of motorists were to be respected. That was followed up by a written policy 6 months later, and Colonel Dentino enforced that policy throughout our tour of duty throughout the administration, and with successful results. We did not receive complaints. We received reports from the ACLU and the NAACP, with whom we were doing business all the time, because one of our priorities was reaching out to minority organizations and building bridges and helping communities. And there was just praise for Dentino's efforts and not for anything else.
Reverend Jackson, you've been with this issue a long time. Profiling as a law enforcement policy began in the early 80s with the DEA. Racial profiling quickly evolved as an issue and has been around in New Jersey for a while. General Del Tufo has argued that there was a significant change in the Florio administration that was carried out but then dropped afterwards. Is that your recollection of how things evolved?
Well, I think to the Florio administration's credit, they did make a genuine and I think a sincere effort to deal with the problem. And I think, in fact, you saw some difference. The problem occurs, however, that toward the end of the administration, the numbers, in fact, started to pick up. And I'm not sure why that happens. But in fact, if you look at the entirety of the administration, no one will argue that the Florio administration, much in contradiction to the Whitman administration, made the effort.
Bill Buckman, you've testified during this week at the Senate hearing itself. What's your assessment historically of the general's claim that his administration consistently made a different approach to this than the Whitman administration?
I don't agree with former Attorney General Del Tufo. As a matter of fact, in the Soto case where we proved the existence of racial profiling, we were studying the statistics of from 88 to 91, right in the middle of Justin Dentino's term and General Del Tufo's term, and we proved our case. So on statistics from 88 to 91, which in the words of Judge Francis, showed that the stop rates of African Americans on the New Jersey Turnpike were indeed stark and almost irrefutable. I'll concede that 2 paper policies were put out during that time, but from my study of the documents and participation in Soto and even study of 90,000 pages of documents which have recently been released that relate to that era, there is little evidence that anything went beyond the promulgation of these paper policies. There's absolutely no evidence that troopers were disciplined for profiling or called on the carpet for it. They were still promoted based on statistics, based on arrests, and as I've indicated, the statistics we proved showed that it was in full swing during those years.
I'm sure you want to respond. Bill Buckman says they were paper policies. Let me direct you and ask you, what do you think is the strongest evidence that, in fact, the administration of which you were a part took concrete steps?
Well, I think there was a reorientation of drug enforcement policy directed towards large-scale conspiracies and away from motorists on the turnpike, because that does nothing, I think, for the war on drugs. So arrests were down, searches were down. The problem is more with the consent searches than with stops. It's when after you stop someone, there's some kind of coercive pressure to consent to a search. And the policies that Colonel Dentino put in place stopped that. People had to have reasonable suspicion that you would turn up contraband before you could even ask to search a vehicle. So the policies were not paper policies. They were enforced by him. I think the arrest and search record, I think the fact that 20 troopers were discharged or not re-enlisted for violating rights. I think if you looked at internal discipline records, you'd see that complaints not only were down, but that when there was a complaint, it was vigorously pursued. And I really get back to the fact that we were working with minority organizations in a variety of initiatives. I won't take your time now to go through them all. But throughout, the ACLU and the NAACP were telling us that there weren't any complaints, that they had dried up because Dentino was enforcing that particular policy.
And let me stop
and that's very significant, I think.
Yeah, let me say, I think because there were not any complaints does not necessarily mean that the policy ended, because one of the unfortunate things we even have continuing today are minorities who, when they are stopped, harassed, throw their hands up, do not complain, and just go the heck on, bitter, angry, and frustrated. In addition to that, I think you also have to do more than just simply look at the searches, because you have thousands of minorities who were stopped, never got a ticket or anything else, of whom the state police did not even keep a record nor report. And so I think it's important, again, if you look at the Soto case, most of the statistics and data in the Soto case came from this period.
All right, Bill Buckman, let me ask you this question. Is there any difference between the approach of these two administrations, or is this a problem that's so deep that it transcends that? I mean, do you say there's no difference between the Florio and Whitman approaches to this?
There's very little difference. It's true that there was a standing operating procedure promulgated at that time that said before you can get a consent to search, you have to have reasonable suspicion, but then you'd have to read that standing operating procedure, because what it gave with one hand, it took back with the other hand. It gave the officer almost complete discretion. More importantly, I disagree with the former Attorney General, because in Soto we tried to get copies of those consents to search. That standing operating procedure promulgated a consent to search data form, and when we asked to examine those data forms, we were told that they don't exist, we don't know where they are, et cetera, et cetera. So either they were totally ignored by the state police, or they didn't want to share them with us because the statistics were so bad.
Reverend Jackson, I take it you do think there is a difference between the Whitman and Florio approaches to this?
Well, if you ask me in terms of outcome, I would agree with Mr. Buckman. If you ask me in terms of attitude, I would say there's stark difference, and that is because the Whitman administration, even after Judge Francis' decision in the Soto case, blatantly said racial profiling doesn't happen. Even with the statistics, which they had in 1996, still said racial profiling doesn't happen. And then to say it crystallized only after the shooting raises a question which I think Mr. Venero needs to respond to tomorrow. If it was not for the shooting, would they have done anything even to today?
Well, let me ask you this. Governor Whitman is now in the federal government. She was appointed to a position by President Bush. The Democrats voted, I believe, along with the Republicans, to make it 99-0. And I don't recall whether you were critical of her taking a position. I seem to recall you might have even said, yes, it was okay. I'm curious as to why a person who you, I think, have been pretty critical of in terms of her posture on profiling in this state, why you didn't say she should not be in any important policy position.
Yes. Our position was we did not oppose the nomination, primarily because we felt, number one, that the United States Senate was not going to oppose her for the Environmental Protection Agency because they would not attach any connection with the racial profiling.
But do you see a connection? I mean, she's in a policy position.
I think it's a problem in terms of leadership.
Okay.
And my concern still remains if she exercises the same leadership of indifference.
So if it was your choice, she wouldn't be in that position?
Oh, absolutely not.
I want to respond. Sure. Mr. Buckman has a very limited perspective on what occurred. He's representing people who have been charged with crime. He's trying, and these are stops that predated our administration. These are Pagano stops. These are ones before Dentino policy went into effect. And he really does not have access to the wide range of information on a statewide basis that shows, I think, pretty clearly that this policy was vigorously enforced by Colonel Dentino and successfully done. I don't think Reverend Jackson was in New Jersey during the Florio administration.
Okay,
this case was tried in 1996, and if he was after information, it certainly wasn't in our
For a moment, let me put
our administration.
Buckman and the Reverend aside. In the midst of the current controversy, which seems to be about, one, will there be anything done to change policies that seem to still persist with the state police, and what responsibility lies with Justice Vennero and former Governor Whitman, why is it important to for people to understand the position you've articulated in this report and said here again today? Why does it matter?
Because it matters that there was a dedicated effort by Governor Florio, Colonel Dentino, and myself to address this and other problems dealing with minority communities with weed and seed and other things. And somehow in the rhetoric that has attended this particular investigation, people are talking about years of neglect. No one's ever paid attention to this. This is the first time that anyone has acknowledged it. And those things are just not accurate.
Well, let me ask you this. What do you think happened then? I mean, three of you have focused on this issue, you with extraordinarily inside experience. What happened in this administration that caused, at the very least, Peter Vennero to now have to concede significant frailties and a failure of this administration to deal with an issue that Chief Justice Porritt said she brought to their attention?
Let me say this to you. I have stayed away from commenting upon what happened after we left office. I don't think that's really not my business.
But that's the pressing public policy question.
Maybe it is, but you asked me why I'm here, why I put that statement in, and that is to make the record clear that something occurred at that point in time. I will say to you this, that in order to make a difference, one has to have a policy, and one has to consistently be mindful of that policy. One has to enforce that policy, and one has to let your subordinates know, in terms of the risk-reward system and everything else, that is the policy and it will be enforced and it's meaningful and it has to be done. And also, you might look at drug policy. The drug policy before 1990, which was to stop people on the turnpike to try to see if there were drugs being transported, was not a policy that we pursued. We thought it was not a policy that was very strong in terms of fighting the war on drugs, and it was potential for abuse existed. Now maybe the policy shifted back because we had a different drug enforcement
Let me give Bill Buckman and Reverend Jackson a chance to respond to the what happened question. I mean, in terms of Vennero, assuming that he did not consciously say, I want to totally ignore profiling because I don't care about it, what do you think happened that allowed this issue that had been debated and talked about, and Chief Justice Porritt said she brought to their attention, and General Del Tufo says he brought to their attention by virtue of earlier policy? Bill, what happened during the Whitman administration?
Well, I agree with Reverend Jackson that there was a different tone during the Whitman administration, but I want to go back very briefly. I don't agree with Attorney General Del Tufo.
Well, we know that.
On the issue, well, except I did study the statistics from your tenure, and we studied statistics up until May of 1991, and there was no difference between 88 and 91.
Your statistics were awful evidence. It was Colonel Pagano's testimony that gave you your victory.
No, it wasn't Colonel Pagano's testimony.
Yes,
it was statistical databases that we put together.
Let me see if I can get Reverend Jackson to answer my what happened question. I mean, clearly something, whatever had happened before, and however long racial profiling was going on, and some people say for a very long time, what happened in the Whitman administration that caused an attorney general and now a justice on the Supreme Court to be in so much trouble over evidence that he ignored significant indicia of a problem?
What happened is truth ultimately rises to the top. In 1996, they said we do not have this data. 1999, they said racial profiling is real, not imagined. They based it on the same data, which in fact they had in 1996. The fact is, the truth came out, and the reality is there's a consequence to pay.
Bill Buckman, we're winding down. Are the state police, as a result of anything happening now, going to change their practices?
I don't know. Sadly, the statistics that we are seeing are fairly consistent with what we've seen for about a decade.
All right. Well, Reverend Jackson, a quick answer, yes or no? Are they going to change those
It's going to take a long time, but they will change.
Okay. General Del Tufo, we started with you. Are you optimistic about the future of coming to grips with this problem, which seems to persist and evidence suggests is even now not being confronted?
Yes, because it just depends on people, putting the right people in place with the right conviction in their heads.
General Del Tufo, Reverend Jackson, Bill Buckman, I want to thank you for being with us. That's it for this edition of Due Process, but we hope you'll be able to join us next week for another bold look at law and social justice. Till then, for Sandy King, for all of us here at Due Process, I'm Raymond Brown. Thanks for watching.
I'd like to see racial profiling eliminated.
I would like to think so that that all parties concerned are taking a serious look at what's going on and investigating.
With all the heat and all the publicity involved with it, I would hope that something positive comes of it.
Make sure that this doesn't happen. Make sure that the state police is a little bit more diversified.
President Bush was talking to the head of the FBI, and he wants to eliminate it. So hopefully, good things will happen now in the future.
They want their jobs. As long as they want their jobs, they're gonna change. They might not, as I say, they're gonna feel the inside, but outside they will change. Put it that way.
Major funding for Due Process was made possible by the New Jersey State Bar Foundation, committed to educating the public about the law. Additional funding was provided by Lawyer's Diary and Manual,